I'm really interested in the canonization. Canonization is a term that means elevation to sainthood of George Floyd. So at a time when these statues are coming down, Robert E. Lee, George Washington, Jefferson, Frederick Douglass, statues are going up to George Floyd. And here's a Yale psychiatry professor talking about why she's very inspired by the example of Saint George Floyd.
I also think, as a Black woman living in America, one cannot minimize the intense frustration watching people that look like you being terrorized. It seemed almost daily, really culminating in the assassination of George Floyd. And one of my mentors, Dr. Ogabegde, talked about George Floyd as a saint, Saint George Floyd. And I really appreciate that framing, because really thinking about how his death will not be in vain. And as a result of the public display of what happened, his murder, there has been a reckoning across this country, internationally, but even in our community at Yale, in terms of how do we commit to anti-racist practices, for sure. But
Now, this is all taking kookiness to a new height. And of course, I wouldn't be worrying about this crank if she wasn't representative of a much broader way of thinking on the left. But I'm interested mostly in the kind of new concept of sainthood being put forward here, because traditionally, to be a saint, you had to be an exemplary person. You had to do some impressive stuff. You didn't have to be perfect. I mean, think about St. Peter. He was a flawed guy. He betrayed Jesus 3 times, denied him. And yet, at the end, he came through. And he became the rock. Jesus himself set up the church. And he ended up being crucified, martyred upside down. So he went voluntarily to a brave death on behalf of what he believed. And you can go down the list of saints through the centuries, and with all of them, St. Augustine and so on, you find monumental academic achievement or monumental achievement in building things. And then you have St. George Floyd. His resume, I guess, would read home invader, drug addict, resistor of arrest, passer of forged checks. I mean, an unexemplary guy. Now, did he deserve to be killed? No. But that is, in a sense, his sole accomplishment, which is not an accomplishment at all, because it is not something he did. It was something that happened to him. And yet it appears that from the left's point of view, this is what makes somebody exemplary. It's not what they do. It's not because someone is, in fact, a moral example. Would you like your kid to grow up like George Floyd? No, nobody would. I don't even think the leftists would. But for them, achievement is a matter of being in the right place at the right time. George Floyd becomes a symbol of social justice. And so even though he was, I think flawed human being is an understatement, a really disgusting, deplorable human being, nevertheless, in the left's perverted scheme of things, it is St. George Floyd and not St. Peter who deserves our moral admiration.